In the aftermath of a truly shocking, violent, horrendous attack on a Southport kiddies summer school, thugs, hooligans, racists, and thick as mince sheep have used the tragedy to take to the streets to riot. What should the government do to tackle this wave of extreme right-wing inspired disruption? Welcome to the latest Downtown Den Politics podcast.
Just looks like bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
So it's me, Frank McKenna, returning from a 2-week break in the fabulous Greek island of Skiathos, joined by the dynamic duo of Joe Phillips, who, of course, the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, and the legend that is Jim Hancock, Downtown's political commentator. And sadly,
is that my name?
The legend Jim Hancock, the legend Jim Hancock. Who we were just reflecting on the fact that Joe and Jim have very ably presented the podcast for the last 2 weeks in my absence. But Jim, I'm getting your name wrong now.
Yeah.
Jim did mistake Tom Cleverley, the footballer, for James Cleverley last week and suggested that Tom will be running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. I have to say, looking at the polls from Conservative members, Tom might have a better chance than James, but we'll come on to that subject later. We'll also look at the latest from America and the presidential election. Every time I go on holiday, some sort of seismic political happening appears to occur because, of course, when I went to Miami a couple of months ago, the general election was called, and within 24 hours of me going away this time, Joe Biden has decided to stand down from the presidential race. So we will get into that. But of course, the whole week has been dominated by the appalling tragedy that took place in Southport, where 3 little girls were murdered, brutally murdered. It's a violent attack that's left a number of people, mostly children, hospitalized, and some of them, I understand, are still very seriously in danger. And we send our best wishes, our love, our prayers to all of those people and the families involved. There are no words that can comfort the people, particularly those parents who have lost children in such a horrendous way. But the tragedy on top of the tragedy has been the reaction from right-wing elements, we think fueled through social media and potentially from people on the international stage as well. It's been suggested that there's been some Russian influence around the rioting that we've seen taking place across the country in the last few days. And it's just been depressing. There's no other word for it in a sense, but I just want to get your take, Joe, on, as I say, what was an absolute tragedy. We sat in the sun in Greece last week and the news came through. There was obviously a lot of Brits in Skiathos. It was just a shock throughout the whole of the hotel, and people were talking about little else during that evening and the following day as the news came through. Shocking, Joe, and as I say, sympathy to all those affected. But the aftermath, if anything, has been even worse, hasn't it?
The aftermath has been absolutely dreadful. And, you know, we're a week on from that terrible, murderous, rampaging attack on the children's dance class. And, you know, we've lost sight of the fact that didn't spur it. What spurred the violence was absolute false information about the possible identity of the perpetrator, who we now know, who is a 17-year-old boy who was born in this country, born in Cardiff, and is a British citizen. And the judge very unusually decided to name him. But nothing was done to say, hang on a minute, this is not true. So the idea that these riots are about people who feel, there's too much immigration, that they feel overwhelmed and all of that stuff, it has got nothing to do with this. This was sparked entirely by false rumours on social media, including people like Nigel Farage, who instead of asking a question in the House of Commons, which he could have done, if he really thought that the security services or the Home Secretary were withholding information, he could have done that. Interestingly, just before we came online, Frank, I noticed he's put a tweet out calling for the recall of Parliament. Well, he couldn't be bothered to go and ask a question. Now, you have a responsibility as a public figure and as an elected member of Parliament. I haven't heard one word from Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson, Suella Braverman, or any of those people who, not so many months ago, were calling for the organised, mainly peaceful marches for a ceasefire in Gaza to be banned because they were hate marches. That's what Suella Braverman called them. I haven't heard one bit of condemnation about the attacks on the police, the attacks on innocent people, the appalling racism. And, if you are that pissed off about immigration, well, we've just had an election. You could have used your vote. And I'm not sure how looting Sainsbury's or setting fire to a library and a food bank is actually going to make anything better for anybody. And at the bottom of all of this is a grieving family, a grieving town, the police trying to deal with the aftermath of that and create a proper investigation, and these bloody idiots just wrecking streets for no other reason than they want a fight.
Absolutely, Joe. Couldn't agree more with the words that you've just expressed there. And Jim, just to get your thoughts on, let's say, can't say it enough, really, can we? A truly tragic situation.
Absolutely, and I agree with the vast majority of what you've both said. I mean, there are some just things to pick up. I mean, not in any particular order, but this recall of Parliament, it's a sort of knee-jerk thing that people say, and actually, the police do have the powers. The legislation's there. People have all social media. Ironically, MPs can express their views. I'm not sure that the recall of Parliament. It's an easy thing to say. I don't see that will be of any value at all. Keir Starmer, of course, using his experience, some have criticised him for coming down heavily on the sort of police response. They will be charged. I think at one point he said everybody involved will be charged. Well, good luck with that. But I think, it's been a major challenge for the government. And just on a wider point, we all talk about manifesto promises and what the government's going to do. But the truth of the matter is they're often swept along by events. The only thing I want to introduce into the discussion is this. The elements that have been involved in this are multiple. There are neo-Nazis in this country. There are football fan groups that are on social media sort of roughly associated with them. It is the school holidays. There are misguided kids with nothing to do who get caught up in it as well. So there's all these sort of elements. But at some point during our discussion this morning, I do think we need to address the fact that the question of immigration, the fact that the number of people coming across in boats hasn't changed a bit because of the general election, that in the background there is this concern by the British people for a fair immigration system, and none of them would excuse the dreadful violence and looting that we've had. But I just want to contextualize it that I wonder whether out of a blue sky all this would have happened. If there wasn't that issue. So I do think the government are going to need to, we're going to need to see this, because the Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, has promised this border force and everything. The government are going to need to start to deliver on that, to deal with the background framework to this. And one last thing, the feeling that people aren't allowed to discuss immigration without being called racist. Now, I know none of us would do that, but sometimes that is done in programs, and I just contextualize that. But basically, I'm so depressed by everything. I mean, that awful attack last Monday. And then these people are hijacking it. You know, they're waiting for their moment. And Yaxley Lennon, who's actually on the run from the law, he was due in court last Monday, fled to Europe, and is now feeding this poison in. And the issue of well, maybe not have time to discuss this morning, but the issue of social media and what X and Elon Musk are going to do about this, you know, and where freedom of speech ends, and there's got to be some sort of, I have to use the word censorship to stop this incitement. But that's my take on it.
It's such a huge challenge for any government, particularly a new government. We talk about your honeymoon period crashing to an end. As you mentioned, Jim, events often do that to governments, throws them off course. And Cameron was about 12 months into the coalition when similar riots were taking place across the country, of course. So those people who are taking to social media, that phrase again, saying, oh, this is because the Labour Party in government. Well, we have these sort of people taking the streets, whoever the government is, I'm afraid. Pick up your point, Jim, about the discussion on immigration needing to be more mature, more balanced, and perhaps prioritised, at least in terms of its perception. I think the government is well aware of the issue of immigration, but whether or not it's comfortable discussing it in the way that you suggest, I think that's a problem, and I think it does need to be picked up upon. However, I think that to use that horrible situation of last Monday to then match that with the immigration argument is just so detached from reality. And the irony is, and you guys know this, that what we will need in terms of tackling immigration, and I think integration into communities of those who do come to settle here, being a big issue as well, is resource. And of course, our resources at the moment are having to go into clearing up the bloody mess that these people are leaving in their wake after their riots.
Absolutely.
So the sympathy that I have for people who have genuine concerns on immigration, in no way are the people who are taken to the streets representative of those people who I may have some sympathy with. And the other thing, the point that you make, Jim, that I couldn't agree more with, is that looking at some of those kids, and they were kids, throwing bricks, throwing fireworks at the emergency services, not just the police, firefighters, ambulances, people dragging ethnic minority people out of cars and beating them up, reports that a Muslim woman in Leeds has been attacked with acid. Listen, I don't care how much you think we've got a problem with immigration. None of that activity is justified. And as you say, Joe, where's Braverman? Where's Farage? Where's Tice? Where's Anderson? Condemning that sort of violence. Absolutely disgraceful response from those sort of people.
It's absolutely appalling, and you know, it is a huge headache for the government. And I think, you know, as Jim says, recalling parliaments, it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's the, you know, it's the lazy way out of somebody who couldn't be asked to go to parliament when it was in session to ask proper questions. But you know, MPs are doing their best. You know, particularly those in areas where the violence has taken part. And I don't think you can ever have a sensible conversation about immigration all the time. You've got these bloody fools on the street. So let's suppose that the terrible attack happened last Monday and it happened to be a white person who had carried out that. Would we have seen this? No. And, you know, if you think about what causes, right, so 2011, we had the riots in Tottenham that then spread. Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, and, you know, that's when we had the 24-hour courts, and it was swift and severe justice, which I think the government will be trying to bring into force this week. But, you know, there is no there is no justification for wanton violence. But you can see how an incident where an apparently innocent, unarmed person is shot by the police provokes outrage. You can see why, you know, back in the day when Cherry Gross died after the police raided her home in Brixton, why those things can spark something. But this is completely unrelated. It has got nothing to do with it. And I would like to see that every single one of those people who've been photographed or videoed or captured on camera, you know, if that's your plumber or your electrician or the bloke you drink with in the pub or your teacher, or somebody that you know, you just say, sorry, you're fired. I don't want anything to do with you. I just want to give you a little vignette. So I belong to a sports club, and we have a lot of young people who engage in sport. And obviously there are safeguarding mechanisms that we need to have in place because of changing rooms, etc., etc. Over the weekend, big competitions on, and part of both the ladies and the gents changing rooms was cordoned off so that the kids had a place to change separate from the adults. It's fine, it's not a big deal. There were a couple of members who got so outraged about this that they thought it was an infringement of their rights, that they thought they were being criminalized, and they put on social media for the club, this is about Islam. We're going to be criminalized. This is Islam taking over. Now, to a man and woman, when this was said out loud, we all went, you're off your rocker. That is absolutely ridiculous. It's a really straightforward safeguard. And, you know, it was condemned and it was closed down. Now, these are intelligent, educated, grown-up people who are putting out nonsense like that. And it's just sort of like, hang on a minute, have you stopped to think about it? And I think, you know, that was quite a shock to me, to think that somebody, even if they thought it, could say it. And I think, you know, unless you can have a sensible conversation with people and say, you know, why have we got a problem with immigration? Well, part of it is the Tories' failure to deal with immigration, and particularly illegal immigration. We know there are millions of people who are kept in hotels because they're in limbo because of the backlog on processing asylum claims. We also know that the vast majority of those people would probably have their applications approved. Therefore, they could get in, you know, get jobs, get work, pay tax, integrate into society. We also know that if you took away every immigrant from this country, we wouldn't have a health service. And actually, if you then drill down even further and say to these people on the streets, when you talk about immigration, what you actually mean is people who are not white. Yes. And that's what needs to be said. You can either have a debate and a conversation about immigration, but this is racism. And the two things are completely and utterly separate. And we've allowed them. And I think, you know, just very, very quickly, Alistair Campbell, when he was running Tony Blair's communications, you know, he had rebut. And I think all the way through, all of us on the other side of the argument have been too slow to rebut and go, hang on a minute, you know, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. And, you know, it's hilarious in a dreadful way that papers like the Mail are, these thugs, these are brutal. And you think, but you have fueled it.
They fueled it.
It's the hypocrisy. And I think somewhere along the line, we need to separate immigration and a proper debate and racism, which was what this is, what we're seeing.
It's a great point, Joe. It's a great point. I think the other thing I pick up on there in terms of your comments, thinking back to 2011, and it's this different attitude that we expect from left-wing politicians when police are being attacked by black activists in that case, and people who were sympathetic to the fact that they felt they were being victimized against by the police. And straight away, you know, I'm sure at the time that the Labour leadership condemned the attacks on the police. We've not seen that from Farage and co this time around. I think he may have put something out today actually saying that the attacks are not acceptable, but it's taken him a long time. There does seem to be a difference in terms of our expectations from the left and the right in respect of these sort of things that take place, social disorder and so on. I think, though, the point that you've just made there, Joe, is a really important one, because it comes back to that point Jim was making, doesn't it? That we have to have a discussion, a mature debate about immigration. And let's face it, the mainstream political parties have run away from it. So the Tories came up with the gimmick of Rwanda and just banged on about that, which wouldn't have solved anything in terms of our immigration issues. And the Labour Party simply chose not to talk about it. And we did say, in fairness, didn't we, in the run-up to the election, that Labour needed to get a grip and get ahead of this issue far better than they have. And sadly, some of those chickens are coming home to roost now, Jim, aren't they?
They are. Just to pick up 1 or 2 points, I'm very interested in what you're saying about the right, the ultra right, and the police. Both in America, with the storming of the Capitol, I thought that, it's almost as if the police are now seen as getting in the way of the right revolution, and this hostility to the police by people who sort of, quite wrongly, of course, think were sort of law and order supporters. It's a very ambiguous relationship. I think that's really important. Just one other thing, if you'll forgive me. There has been a response. I mean, the Imam in Southport was magnificent after his mosque had been attacked. He absolutely, lovely gentleman who said he worked with the community. But we have seen pushback in Weymouth, for instance, where, of course, they had that floating barge. There were white people demonstrating in an anti-Nazi movement, but also in Liverpool we had Nans Against Nazis. Did you see that elderly lady? Fantastic. Yeah. But in Bolton, the young Asian youth were not having it, and this is the danger, that you really get a full-blown, well, I have to call it a racial riot. So that's to come on to your point. Not talking about it creates a vacuum into which these awful incidents occur. So, I mean, Yvette Cooper has promised to set up this enhanced border force, greater cooperation with the European Union. It needs to be worked on pretty quickly. I think that's what you're hinting at. And then, we've got to see the numbers in these hotels coming down, because the processing is quicker. Now, obviously, we have to give the government a few months to do that. But these incidents in the last week have really put the pressure on Labour to start delivering on this issue.
But you know what? I don't know if either of you have seen the piece by Dame Sarah Khan, who was race and cohesion independent advisor to Rishi Sunak, and before that Theresa May. And she published a report for Michael Gove, and she says that the Conservative government have left this wide open because they've stoked culture wars, and what we're seeing now is a change of tack about two-tier policing. And that is the next argument that will be deployed as people think, oh, actually, maybe this has gone a bit too far. But this is outrageous. Why are they being treated so harshly when Muslim? I mean, I've heard absolute nonsense over the weekend about, Muslims, Muslim gangs armed with knives being allowed to walk through the streets of Stoke and being told to just put down their weapons, while hooligans are chucking stuff at police and being arrested. And this two-tier policing becomes very, very dangerous, because then you end up with an attack based purely on racism and false information on the police. And then you have a complete breakdown of law and order. And I think that's what we need to watch. But Sarah Khan's piece is real. And she said, she warned, other people warned, and they kept saying to senior politicians over the last 14 years, you need to do this because you're not having a proper debate, and that vacuum will be filled by the far right. And look what's happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, let's close the conversation by asking that million-dollar question, which is, what can the government do about this? As you say, Joe, back in 2011, when he was head of the DPP, then Keir Starmer was sort of leading the way in terms of ensuring that justice was quick. People were given significant sentences, jail terms. But it's got to be more than that, this, I would suggest. I think there's got to be a more strategic view of the whole issue. Equally, in all of this, we are forgetting those 3 little girls who've been
Yeah.
murdered. And, you know, the real sickening thing for me about all these riots and all this carry on from these thugs and hooligans is the fact that those people have almost been forgotten already. It's less than a week. Well, it's a week today that it happened. But if you're Keir Starmer, Jim, and Yvette Cooper, well, what are the sort of things that you think they can practically be doing to quell what is an out of control situation?
Yes, I'm really depressed coming into this podcast this morning because I knew you were going to ask that, and I am struggling. I mean, you know, if there is sufficient number of people, well, I mean, we'll see whether it carries on today. I'm not trying to trivialize this, but we're now into the new working week. You know, was this to some extent the weekend thing and it'll quieten down, or even if there's enough people to keep it going, then the state's going to be seriously challenged. I think there's 2 approaches. There obviously is the security issue, and I'd be interested when Joe makes the next contribution to address this, because I have heard this discussed over the weekend, because Keir Starmer said, you know, we're going to be using, you know, CCTV and all sorts of facial recognition to bear down on these people. There have been people who are concerned about civil liberties who are a little bit queasy about the way in which particularly facial recognition is used, how accurate it is, and whether that is an oppressive state. And then on the oppressive state thing, of course, the ultimate thing they could do is to ban these marches. But of course, we know that the ultra-right want this escalation. They are trying to prove that this isn't a liberal, generous country, that it is an oppressive country. And the more you rack it, it's a very difficult balance for the Prime Minister and Home Secretary. And the more you rack it up, the more the ultra-right say, see what I told you? So there is that. But I think, you know, so there is a security balance to be done. And I think Joe made the point that, you know, if it's your plasterer and your decorator and your plumber, or even the person who does your IT, let's not make it working class. Or a teacher for that matter, who's been identified by this, they should lose their jobs, and so that might act as a disincentive. But obviously, the main thing is to see if Yvette Cooper can get this trans-European cooperation and to you know, I mean, the stop the boats. It was a foolish thing for the previous Prime Minister to promise, because it's very difficult to achieve. But that is the thing that people see, even though we know it's a small number of the actual illegal immigration problem we've got in this country. But they see that all the time, and if that could be
I think,
stopped,
Jim, just to cut across you, sorry, I don't think any of these people who are rioting on the streets will give a toss as to whether Yvette Cooper, Keir Starmer, or anyone else had a practical solution to the immigration problem. These people, as Joe said, are racist thugs. Yeah. And the people who are following them are just thugs. I don't think they've got a thought in their head, some of these clowns. You know, you look at them and you think, well, you know, as I said in my introduction, thick as mince. And I think I'm being kind to them. But the idea that you can placate racists with I think the government have got to have a strategy. I think we've got to tackle immigration. I think we've got to have a mature conversation about it. I've said all of those things. The idea that Yvette Cooper came tomorrow and said, look, we've come up with this fantastic concordat with the Italians, the French, the Germans, we're going to start to bring numbers down. You think that would stop these absolute bombastic racist pricks from taking to the streets and attacking police and emergency services? I'm afraid I don't. So I think it's a dual attack that the government have to go on, for me. And part of it is, as I say, opening that conversation in a more mature way. But the other side of this same coin, in my view, is we've got to come down on these people, Joe. The ton of bricks, civil liberties or not, we've got to start to fast track justice. I tell you what, wouldn't it be ironic if we recommissioned Bibby Stockholm and stuck some of these bastards on them?
Well, now there's a good idea. Yes, and the thing about justice is, and why it worked in the riots in 2011, is because it was the speed at which it was delivered. I mean, I think there was a bloke who was jailed for 4 years for stealing a bottle of water that was worth about £3 or something. And it's actually that. It's not about, oh, you've got a charge and you'll appear in court. We know there's a backlog and all the rest of it. It's about doing it very quickly, and it's about going, okay, right, your benefit's going to be stopped, your driving license is going to be taken away. Actually, you're going to find it much harder to get a doctor's appointment, to get a passport, for instance, and those are draconian things. But you can't ban a march that's not an organised march. That's the problem. So all the mechanisms that are there under the 2013 Public Order Act don't work. I mean, you can do a certain amount because you've got the sort of affray and public disorder, and you've got the people wearing balaclavas and concealing their identity, all of which the police have got the powers to deal with. But you've got several issues here going on at once. You've got the issues of civil liberties, which I think, as a Liberal Democrat and as a Liberal, I feel slightly queasy about. But it has been used, and it has been used effectively to stop football hooliganism. If all of us think back to 30-40 years ago, it was terrible, and those sort of measures have been used very effectively, and these people must be easily identified. And the other one, the big elephant in the room, and I think it's impossible for any one single government to deal with, is the social media companies. A lot of this is coming out of Russia, it's coming out of the Far East, it's coming out of all sorts of, and they are agile and they can move, and they are spreading disinformation. And the really awfully, terribly sad thing about this is that these idiots who think they're some sort of warriors actually are being manipulated, and they will be the people that end up with prison sentences or a criminal record, not the people who are putting out the rubbish that they're then following. I mean, you could say, oh, look, the sky's turned green. That's because of, COVID being pumped into the atmosphere, and they'd all be out, protesting about that. And I think the problem is that they're so stupid that they're believing this crap, and they're being manipulated. And Elon Musk doesn't give a toss. No. They're not going to do anything. They couldn't care less. And, you close down that one, it's whack-a-mole, there's another thing, and they go underground. So it's very difficult, I think, to go to Jim's point. You can't ban the marches because they're not organised marches. But, of course, they have every right to organise a march if they go through the proper process and work with the police and work out a route. They won't do that. That requires too much. And, of course, the other ridiculous, very British thing is, if it had rained over the weekend, I suspect we wouldn't have seen quite the same levels. But, a sunny weekend, all those beer cans, tells you all you need to know.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to draw the conversation to a close. It's depressing. And I'm sure it's a hard listen for people. It's a hard discussion for us, for us to have. But let's just try and put this into some context, because I absolutely understand Jim's comment. He's depressed coming onto this discussion, this podcast this morning. But back in the 30s, we had the black shirts and Mosley. We had in the 60s the Rivers of Blood speech from Enoch Powell. The 70s was dominated in terms of this sort of activity by the National Front. That then morphed into the British National Party. So it's not new. And thankfully, up until this point, we've always saw them off. We've always been able to see the back of extreme right-wing politicians or politics, or call it what you want, the racist element in our country. And I'm hopeful that if we can get enough reasonable voices from across the political spectrum, then we can see this mob of thugs off as well. I'd also point out that you made this point, Joe. We've recently had a general election, and 4 million people basically voted for the party that was standing on the platform of immigration. 4 million out of north of 70 million. So that puts it into some context as well. We're talking about cumulatively thousands of people across the country, in the low thousands, rioting and taking part in this horrendous activity. You think back to the march against the Iraq War and how many millions took to the streets on that. So I think that we can be, rightly concerned the word that Jim used, depressed about the situation as it's unfolded this week. But actually, in the context of what I've just said, I think we can hopefully look forward to things settling down and the government getting a grip of the problem and hopefully being supported by the official opposition as well. One final point, if I may, just a quick mention for Steve Rotherham, who is the Mayor of Liverpool City Region, who had the unfortunate task of responding, going to Southport, part of Liverpool City Region. As the Mayor, I have to say, I thought he handled himself magnificently. So hats off to Steve. And I know he's got those issues continuing that he's having to deal with, but he's been measured. He's been reasonable in terms of the rhetoric that he's used. He's not been trying to stoke things up and fan the flames the way some politicians have, and absolute credit to him. I'm sure we'll return to this subject, sadly, in the weeks ahead, but let's move on very quickly because I'm conscious that Jim wants us to keep these podcasts less than an hour. So we're going to run over the hour. So,
he always believes in leaving them wanting more, Frank.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't want to be crude this time of the morning, Joe, but apparently always leaves people wanting more, but that's another story. Listen, let's just very briefly get your thoughts on the Conservative Party leadership contest. There's 6 people in the running. Not going to go through all the names. Tom Cleverley has actually ruled himself out, Jim. I did have a word with his agent and he said he's not interested. But it seems that Robert Jenrick has emerged as the favourite. Well, what do you make of that, Jim?
Not a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I in my blog last week, I did my tips for the runners and riders. You know, I think that James Cleverley and Mel Stride would be my sort of people. I mean, I think we're not almost definitely looking at people who are going to sort of carry the burden during the dark years of opposition. I'm not sure we're looking at the next Prime Minister here. But you know, I just feel, for the reasons we've just been discussing, that this country needs moderation, and the idea the Conservative Party would elect people who, to some degree or another, you know, are fanning the flames. I mean, Jenrick is defined by his opposition to immigration. I remind you that he resigned from the government because he didn't think the Uganda scheme went far enough.
Rwanda.
So that, Rwanda, yeah, the Rwanda scheme went far enough. So that's but you know, we know that this system that they've devised is ultimately going to leave it to the members of the Conservative Party. As I think I said in a previous one, these are the people that gave us Liz Truss last time. So if we go through it, there's going to be this debate during August, then the Parliamentary Party will refine it down to 4 people. So that means they can't remove all the right wingers. They go to the conference, then they bring it down to 2. But I suggest the conference will be full of the party membership, and if the Parliamentary Party then should pluck out Tom Tugendhat and Mel Stride or James Cleverley, you know, there'll be uproar. So there is going to be one of these people from the right in the final vote for the Conservative Party membership, and you know, on past track record, they will choose the right winger. So you are right to address us to Jenrick. He fills the bill for a lot of people and may well emerge from this.
I have to say, the Labour Party would be delighted if Jenrick was elected leader of the Conservative Party. From a tribal perspective, it doesn't do the country much good. I agree with you, Jim. You much prefer that sort of one nation, reasonable Conservative leader. Tugendhat really disappointed me in sort of waving this flag about the ECHR and saying, oh, we should get, you know, we should consider, if that's not reform, we should get out of that. So from somebody who I saw perform really well, actually, at a Conservative function at Doncaster Racecourse a couple of years ago, would you believe? He's sort of gone down in my estimations in terms of that comment he made. But I'm still saying, you know, very quiet, dark horse, but Priti Patel could be the one that comes through the middle. Tories very seldom go for favourites. So Kenny Badenoch, all of a sudden, her star has started to dim a little. Jenrick is going to go through August campaign, and I'm sure all the talk's going to be about him. I don't think he's the most charismatic either. That's the other thing. I can't see him performing particularly well at that conference in Birmingham in September. But Priti Patel just going about things quietly. I still have a sneaking suspicion, and I think she would be a much tougher opponent for Labour, Joe, than someone like Jenrick.
Yeah, I know you've always had a bit of a soft spot for Priti Patel, Frank.
I wouldn't go that far, Joe. I wouldn't go that far, Joe. I mean, it comes to something when she was probably one of the most extreme Home Secretaries, and then she starts to look reasonable because of Suella Bravo.
Well, I know she looks like Mary Poppins, doesn't she? But, she has, as you rightly say, she has been quiet. She has been relatively dignified. She is still quite popular, I think, amongst Tory grassroots and amongst quite a lot of MPs. And she certainly hasn't come out of the starting blocks to fuel and fan the rhetoric of hate and culture wars and stuff like that over the last week. And I think she might be a possible thing. I agree with you about Tom Tugendhat. I used to think he was quite sensible and quite good and quite bright, but he seemed to go, drink the Kool-Aid. And I know, let's appeal to be more reform than reform. I think James, brother of Tom Cleverly, obviously, he could be quite good. Whether or not he's got the appetite to be a leader of opposition with probably no realistic chance of being prime minister, I don't know. He's relatively young, and I think he's quite ambitious. Mel Stride, maybe he's quite a good minister for broadcasting. Doesn't make you leader of the opposition. I'm coming around to your way of thinking, Frank. I think Priti Patel might be the one.
I think the other thing that you've got to remember about Priti Patel, she never fell out with Boris Johnson. And Johnson is still seen among that wing of the party that will make the final decision as a hero. And the other thing that I would suggest she might be seen as is a compromise candidate that can unite the Tory party. So that's why I still think, and I've said it for months now, I still think Priti Patel has got a great chance of winning it. I think that will cause the government some difficulties. As I say, if Jenrick gets it, then 10 years is guaranteed for Labour. I think it'd be like the quiet man when he was elected by the Tories, Ian Duncan Smith. Gosh, do you remember that? Right, listen, we're going to bring the first part of our podcast to a close, and we're going to be going over to the United States of America, James, and we're going to be talking about all the things that are happening there. And again, I have to say, you two did disappoint me last week in dismissing my suggestion that Donald Trump's VP pick might get dumped. So we look into that in a bit more detail and see how Kamala's going on and see whether she's going to make the right pick as far as her vice presidential running mate is concerned. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. I'm joined by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. I am, of course, Frank McKenna, the Chief Exec and Group Chair of Downtown in Business, and we're just going to turn our attention to the fascinating American presidential race. It's become fascinating whilst I was away because Joe Biden decided to, my opinion, rightly, stand down from the race. Kamala Harris has taken over the reins as the Democrat candidate. The polls have narrowed. Indeed, in some polls, Harris is seen as being in the lead, but it is too close to call. And for the first time in many a year, people are suggesting that the VP, the vice presidential pick, may actually swing the whole thing. And I suggested in a little message that I sent to my erstwhile colleagues, Joe and Jim, last week, that J.D. Vance may now be seen as a mistake of a pick by Donald Trump. He's made some bizarre comments. He's certainly seen, I think it would be fair to say, as anti-female, anti-women. He's totally against abortion. He thinks that females should stay in the marriage even if they're being domestically abused and violated. He's got all sorts of strange views. But of course, when Donald Trump was sailing to victory over poor old Joe, then it didn't appear to be much of an issue. Now, of course, you've got this energised Democrat campaign. You've got potentially this week a bigger bounce again for Kamala Harris, because they've got the convention coming up and she's going to announce her vice presidential pick tomorrow. So, Jim, I put it to you again. Perhaps you may take this suggestion a little more seriously. Donald Trump, if he sees those polls continuing to get worse for him, it would not be beyond the realms of possibility that he thinks, look at this guy could cost me the election. I'm going to get rid. And to fuel those flames, James, let me just remind you that old Donald was not particularly complimentary when he was asked by a journalist this week what he thought of J.D. Vance. He dismissed him. He said, well, the VP pick doesn't really much matter. People are voting for me. Don't worry about that fella. So what are you saying now? You still think that I'm living in fairy dairy land in terms of him getting dumped?
I always take your ideas with the utmost seriousness, Frank. I'm sorry we didn't give more time to it. You always know what's coming. You always know what's coming when someone says that to you, don't you? But no, I'm sorry if we didn't spend enough time on it last week. I think we had a pretty busy agenda, but I just think, I mean, you know, it is the first duty of a vice presidential candidate to do no harm. There's an article I was just looking at says, like, a bit like a doctor, do no harm. And he has, you're quite right to point out that he has embarrassed Trump to some extent, particularly with this childless thing. We did discuss this last week, because I remember saying to Joe, of course, that Andrea Leadsom did that to Theresa May, and it cost her, you know, she had to withdraw from the Tory leadership election in 2017. And his position with women is already difficult. The Republican position with an awful lot of women is already difficult because of abortion. So they needed to shore that up. And referring to childlessness, and Joe will have a view about this, talking about cat women, which I understand to be that's kind of cats as a substitute for having children. I mean, it's appalling. And so he has damaged them. However, there's been so much turbulence in this presidential race this summer. We've, you know, the president standing down, Trump nearly getting assassinated. I just think, on balance, that Trump will decide that, you know, having a psychodrama within his party will be very difficult. Of course, the thing that's about to happen almost immediately after this podcast is that Kamala Harris will choose her vice presidential candidate. And I think we'll probably come on to that for a moment in a while. But I just think, on balance, that, you know, he may be quite furious inside at what he did. And of course, he chose Vance when Biden was still in the race. Okay. If Biden had stood down beforehand, you know, names like Nikki Haley, who, of course, fought for the nomination initially, might come into the frame, although obviously there's an awful lot of bitterness between Trump and Haley. But as you've hinted, Frank, Trump, in a funny sort of way, is incredibly pragmatic. And it's not beyond the realms of possibility. You can say, oh, come on, Nikki, we didn't mean all those things. Come along my side. She might say, might use an expletive, but she might get attached to this one-term president, as he'll be, and I'm in a good position for 4 years' time. So it's possible, Frank, but I just think there's been so much turbulence that I don't think Trump will risk it.
I think the problem that they've got, though, in all seriousness, is that Vance does stay on the ticket. The age issue is now Trump's problem. 78. He's going to be 82 by the time the presidency finishes, if we assume he was elected. And there's every possibility that Vance, at some point, takes over as president. You know, he literally is a heartbeat away from the most powerful position in the free world. And that is a message that I think, if I was a Democrat, be pushing really, really hard, Joe, because the idea of, okay, Donald is seen as, you know, he can say the odd thing and he gets away with it. He said, didn't he, famously, that he could go and shoot somebody in the street in New York and people would still vote for him. I'm not sure that Vance has got the same sort of commitment from Republican voters, or more importantly, floating voters. So I think it's a problem for them, Joe.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think the women issue is going to become a bigger problem. And although, there are many women who support the Republican Party and they support Donald Trump, God knows why, but they do. The fact that Kamala Harris has mobilized and has energized with such alacrity and such financial backing is going to be absolutely huge. And there was a really good piece by Carol Cadwallader in The Guardian over the last few days and about the cat ladies and the childless cat ladies. And she said, in the old days, they used to call us witches. And you know why men were frightened of witches? Because we know shit. And actually, that still rings true. Yeah. And I think that Trump and Vance are a heartbeat away from overstepping the mark on the way they talk about Kamala Harris. And even the most hardline Republican woman, they wouldn't recognize the term sisterhood, but there might be a point where they go, that's gone too far. You can be rude and offensive about her name and her ethnicity, but that's gone too far. And I think, yes, I'm sure Trump is bitterly regretting that he didn't wait, and he was so cocksure that Biden was going to be his opponent, and he would have done better with Nikki Haley. It would have been a better look. But I'm afraid, I think I agree with, well, I'm not afraid. I think I agree with Jim that I think Trump actually, in the end, it's all about him, and he'll just dismiss it and say, this person is not important. So, you're voting for me. That's what you get. So I think they'll go on. I think the choice of running mate for Kamala Harris is very interesting. So there are three in the frame: Josh Shapiro, what are they called? Tim Walz and Mark Kelly. There seems to be quite a lot of angst directed towards Josh Shapiro. And Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, seems to be like, the popular choice. She's got to appeal beyond that group of women and young people and Black and Latino voters. She's also got to appeal to the the white working class men, because we know that America, it's that middle bit that's the killer for the Democrats. And unless you can do that, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this sort of the white working class who feel they're ignored, feel that they're not counted, feel that they're sneered at. And to a certain extent, Hillary Clinton failed because she didn't understand and she didn't recognize that. She just assumed that everybody would think she was right. If Kamala Harris gets the right bloke in as her VP, then I think, there's a real contest. But it's neck and neck at the moment. And I think, the thing that's made the difference is that she has lightened the campaign. And the one thing that Trump will hate more than anything, as all narcissists do, is somebody taking the piss out of him. Yeah. And the idea that you just say, not only is he old, he's weird, is much more damaging to that man's inflated ego than anything about his record on policy, because he hasn't got any. So I think, and I must say, I don't know if either of you have seen it or any of our rapt viewers have seen it, but I watched the most fascinating and horrific documentary called A Storm Foretold about Roger Stone, who of course was Nixon's fixer and has been Trump's fixer. And you watch that and you think, oh my God, this is so chilling. Anyway, there's a lot to play for, but I think it's exciting.
Any of those three names, Joe, that you think she'll go for? Who would you pick out?
I mean, just listening to commentators, I think Mark Kelly, he's an American hero. He's a former astronaut. He's seen to be a good bloke with broad appeal. Josh Shapiro, there are people on the left of the Democrats who think he's a bit too conservative. He's also Jewish, and that has got a whole issue with Gaza and Palestine, and that which is as big an issue there as it is in this country. Tim Walz is the person who came up with the phrase about Trump being weird. So weird, he would be, and I did see somebody had posited the idea last week that Pete Buttigieg could be. But I think, to have a Black woman is one thing. To have a Black woman with a gay running mate is probably one step too far for America at the moment. But, I think any of those three, my cat would be better than Donald Trump. But I think my money would probably be on Mark Kelly, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah, it's a shame about Pete, because I've seen him. Some of his performances on Fox News are absolutely fantastic. But as you say, Joe, it's probably a step too far to.
But you've got other roles. You've got Secretary.
Yeah, he's transported. He's a cabinet. He's Minister for Transport, as we would describe, isn't he, at the moment?
Exactly. But you put somebody in like Obama did with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary. In fact, there's a lot of very influential. And probably arguably bigger jobs than being vice president.
Yeah. Oh, well, yes, it's being described as it's not worth a bucket of piss. One vice president actually described the job as. That was during your time. It was back in the 40s, wasn't it?
It was warm spit, actually, but. Let's elevate the discussion. I think I agree with Joe. I think Shapiro would be the best, but the Gaza thing has really split the Democrats. I was listening to an interesting analysis of the Democratic Party, which says that they are actually a sort of bit of a rabble. They've got their cliques and they sort of come together, but there are different factions within the Democratic Party, as we saw when Bernie Sanders ran for it. But so I just think the Gaza thing is going to remain very potent throughout this campaign. And I think that probably will do for Shapiro. Walsh has come in with this really clever line about being weird, because it's sort of, in a way, it's sort of gentle, but it sort of sums it up. If you can kill people with humor rather than direct attack very often in politics. And so he's obviously a talented man, but I think they'll go for Mark Kelly, a governor of Minnesota, one of those Midwestern states. Great backstory, astronaut, veteran, and of course his wife was badly injured in an attack. So he's got a good backstory. But normally the vice president doesn't shift a lot of votes, but it's so tight in America that a few thousand votes here and there in swing states will make the difference.
It could make all the difference this time round, absolutely. And it's going to be a fascinating race. And I don't think we could have said that a fortnight ago. I think we'd all resigned ourselves to the fact that Trump was on his way to the presidency and all the things that...
well, I always said, in fairness to me, I don't get much fairness on this podcast. I did all the way along say I couldn't understand how people were denigrating Kamala Harris. I thought she wasn't doing anything wrong. And of course, now that she's liberated to be the candidate, she's showing all her skills. So, go Kamala.
And in fairness to me, James, I will get Christopher, our producer, to dig out the comment that I made about the fact of the early debate. I felt was potentially a Democratic tactic to see whether Biden was actually up for the job. And it was that debate ultimately that cost him, I think, because it was such a bloody car crash. And thankfully, we didn't have to wait till September, because it would have been far too late at that stage to change the candidate. She's got a chance, is what we can say. And as I say, it's going to be a very, very exciting race. Listen, I'm conscious that Jim's got his stopwatch on, so we will close our podcast and our conversation for this week. Thanks, guys. And the first part of this podcast was hellishly difficult for us to discuss. You can never get the tone right when you're talking about the sort of tragedy that was witnessed last Monday in Southport. I just want to end on sending our very, very best wishes, regards, and as I said earlier, all our thoughts and prayers to the families affected by that tragedy. We'll see you all again next week.